Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiator, and we're going to talk today about something which I don't talk about a lot on my channel, and that's firearms, historical firearms, so from the 19th century, which tie in with the swords. If I just grab a sword out of a sword stand here. Okay, so I usually talk about Victorian era swords. So what we're going to look at relatively briefly, and I'll explain why in a second, we're going to look at two incredibly important Victorian era rifles, one of which I've shown before, one of which I haven't because I've only just acquired it, and talk about a few things around those. The reason I'm going to be relatively brief, and I will go into more depth on some of these things in future videos. I know it's my favourite thing to say, but the reason I'm going to be fairly brief is it is so hot at the moment. So for any of you in the UK, you'll know I think we're having the driest summer on record forever. So in modern times anyway, since modern records began. And it's really hot, and where I film here, this is my garden room, and essentially it's like a glorified shed. And it's like a sauna in here. So if I appear rather shiny, even more shiny than normal, that's the reason why. So first up, this is a rifle that I have shown before. This is my Pattern 1853 3-band Enfield rifle. Now, the reason that this is an incredibly important rifle, actually, certainly in British history, and I would say even beyond that, is because it was the first rifled, as they called it, rifled musket, but let's call it a rifle. It was the first rifle that was standard for all British infantry from around 1854 really onwards. And so this was used in the Crimean War, it was used in the Indian Mutiny, and it was also used in the US Civil War as well. So these were sold on contract. In fact, they were used, I believe, by the North, the Union, but they were most famously perhaps used by the Confederacy, the South. Obviously the North, during the US Civil War, the North had control of most of the factories, and so the South had to import a lot of their arms and equipment. And Britain, ever the shall we say, morally neutral, money-making kind of empire of the day, was quite happy to sell weapons to anyone who'd buy them pretty much at that point, anyone who wasn't a direct enemy of Britain. And funnily enough, actually, due to certain threat to Canada, which again is a fascinating bit of history, but actually at that point Britain considered the Union more of a threat to the British Empire because of a threat to Canada than the Confederacy. So it was sort of, even you could say politically, within Britain's interest to export weapons to the South. In some cases there were also families living in the South who had close relatives in Britain, and some people in Britain were still profiteering from the slave trade, despite the fact that actually Britain had officially banned the slave trade half a century earlier than America. But kind of behind the scenes, clearly there were still people benefiting from the slave trade in Britain. But anyway, that's a complicated topic for a whole another video, probably not even for me, because I don't know enough about the topic. But there you go. For anyone who doesn't know anything about it, there's a little bit. But the Pattern 1853 3-band muzzle loading rifle. So that's the important thing, and that's the most important thing for this video that I'm talking about. So to load this rifle, you essentially have a paper cartridge. Most modern people shooting these today, people like me who shoot muzzle loading guns, would use powder out of a powder flask, and you literally put the powder down, then a wadding, then a ball, and then a patch or something. Maybe not actually with a rifle, because it's down, the bullet's tight enough to keep it in place, but you might sometimes put something over the front, but probably not usually with this particular gun. And then you put a percussion cap on the back, so you're just take the nipple guard off. You put your percussion cap on the back. This is at half cock, it can't go off at this point. Then you pull it to full cock and it's ready to shoot. That you're essentially making the cartridge inside the breech of the rifle. But they did, for speed loading, carry paper cartridges with all of those components already contained in them. So within the paper cartridge, you'd have the powder, you'd have the wad, you'd have the bullet. One slight disadvantage, or the obvious advantage of the paper cartridge, is it's much quicker to load. If you've got your ready-made cartridges, and stick the percussion cap on the back and it's ready to shoot. The disadvantage, it can be, not always, but it can be with certain types of cartridge, you might not get such a tight fit to the bore of the gun. and you also got lots of paper in there and other bits and pieces. So you can sometimes have a loss of accuracy, sometimes a loss of power, sometimes more fouling in the rifling, which will make it progressively harder to load as you shoot it. So modern shooters using these on ranges tend to load separate powder and wadding and bullet, because you can get essentially a more accurate, often more consistent in terms of the powder inside as well, but a more consistent load and shooting experience, more accurate, more powerful. Okay, so that was an incredibly important rifle because it was a rifle. Now, not to say that obviously rifles have been around actually for hundreds of years actually by that point, but in the British Army there had never been a regulation rifle for all branches of the infantry to use, and some people would say that this was the firearm which contributed in some part to the beginning of the Indian Mutiny, because the cartridges, where you had to bite off the paper at the end, were essentially had a fatty product on them for lubricant, and to protect them as well from moisture, and that was made allegedly of pig and cow fat produce, which obviously offended both Hindus and Muslims. That was given for one reason for why some regiments in India refused to use that cartridge and got angry. And in actual fact, the beginning of the mutiny is far more complicated than that. Again, a massive topic, one I won't go into depth here, but there had been previous mutinies, and indeed some of the mutinous regiments went on to use those cartridges and these guns in the mutiny. So that's not the only reason, although many books you read on Wikipedia pages, that kind of stuff, will say that that was the reason for the Indian Mutiny. It wasn't that simple by any stretch. Also, most significantly, it was exactly 100 years since the Battle of Plassey and this kind of stuff. But anyway, so this incredibly important rifle, incredibly good rifle, relatively accurate up to about 1,000 yards. Now, that's not to say that most people out there, you or I, could necessarily hit anything at 1,000 yards. But theoretically, the machine itself, the gun itself, was capable of being accurate out to about 1,000 yards. And some marksmen could indeed hit, for example, Siege of Sevastopol during the Crimean War. Some snipers, some marksmen were shooting Russian gunners off the top of the fortifications from, like hundreds of yards away, from like 500-600 yards away. So they were very accurate. And some people these days, even today, still shoot these rifles. In fact, I know people who shoot these rifles out to 800 to 1,000 yards. As I say, very difficult to hit anything at that range, but nevertheless, if you yourself, if you can remove or reduce the human error element and the fact that you're using iron sights and you're not using telescopic sights and like that, the actual gun itself is very accurate and very powerful. It uses a 5.77 caliber bullet. Okay, so very effective rifle, but in the 1860s, even you could say before that, but let's say in the 1860s, it started to become apparent that lots of people were switching to breech-loading firearms. Okay, and the reason that, the advantages that breech-loading offers is it means that all of your loading can happen at this end, and you don't have to be loading things at this end. Okay, so that's the number one advantage. Number two advantage is you can, if you've got pre-made cartridges, as they did do by this point, then you can stuff them in the back without much trouble. And metallic cartridges really changed things big time. Now, at this point, I will say, while I know a fair amount about these things, I am not an expert by any means. If you want to find out really supreme levels of detail about this and the following rifles I'm going to briefly talk about, look at the British Muzzleloaders channel. There are other channels like Forgotten Weapons and Cap and Ball, which I myself watch, but British Muzzleloaders particularly focuses on these sorts of firearms that I'm talking about here. So this was the pattern 1853, and in the 1860s, they essentially brought along a breech-loading adaptation to this gun, the Snyder patent essentially, where you have a trap, what's essentially like a door at the back, where you can open up the back of the breech, stuff your cartridge in, close it, cock, stick a cap on, fully cock, and you're ready to shoot. So it's a much quicker form of loading. all your loading is done at the back of the gun. Another advantage with breech loading, incidentally, is muzzle loading. You'll notice a lot of people go, oh, why in the Napoleonic Wars did they all stand in lines to shoot each other? Why weren't they a bit more, you know, stealthy, moving around more and sort of crouching or lying down? Well, the fact is, with a muzzle loader, you've got to load it. And really, to load a gun like this is most easily and rapidly done standing up. You need access to the bits for loading around your body, and you need to be able to do the ramrod stuff. And really, you can only practically really, I mean, you can do it lying down, you can do it sitting down, but if you want to keep up a decent rate of fire, you can most effectively do it standing up. And that's one of the reasons that muzzle loading, sort of powder and shot kind of era of warfare, has people standing up in lines, because their job is to stand there and deliver lead at the enemy. And to do that with a muzzle loader, you really need to be standing up most of the time. Once you've got a breech loader, you can now load that in all sorts of positions really quite easily. Okay, so it fundamentally changes the way that infantry can operate. So the Snyder kind of stopgap, you could call it, stopgap breech loading mechanism came in. Now, at that point, I want to mention a fact that in the 1860s in Germany, what became Germany, or Prussia, and France. In France, they had the chassepot, and in Prussia, they had and other parts of Germany, they had the drays, sometimes both known as needle guns. Essentially, those are early bolt action guns. Okay. They have a big advantage in terms of rate of fire, but they had some disadvantages. The drays had really quite a short effective range. Okay, I think if I remember correctly, it was about 300 yards, something like that. No, maybe 200 to 300 yards, which for a lot of combat is enough, and it had a very high rate of fire. The French chassepot had a longer range. I think it was kind of 2 or 3 times that much. Still not as long range, incidentally, as the earlier muzzle-loading guns. And the reason for, one of the big disadvantages to some of these early breech loaders was the breech. So if you imagine you've got a big ignition, you've got an explosion going on in the breech of your gun. Okay, what you want is all of that energy to be going out of the far end of your firearm, such that it's shooting a bullet far away from you, as far and powerfully as possible, and not hurting you, not doing anything out of the back that you don't want it to do. And with a traditional muzzle-loaded percussion lock, that's fine, because this is essentially a sealed end. The only hole at the back is for the percussion cap at the back, and it's just a little needle width hole. And yeah, you do get some exhaust out of that, but very, very little really. Breech loaders, early breech loaders, had a problem with venting things backwards. Now that partly means that's uncomfortable and not nice for you. For the chassepot was quite famous, the French chassepot rifle used in the Franco-Prussian War, the 1866 pattern, I think. It was quite well known for having a bad venting of gas problem at the back end. Now, the venting of gas means that's nasty for you. It might burn you, might hurt you, might get in your eyes. Number one, we'll come back to that in a second. But number two, it means you're losing energy. Anything that's being shot out the back isn't being shot out the front. So you only have a finite amount of joules of energy being created here, and if some of it's coming out of the back, then it's reducing what's coming out of the front. And that's one of the important reasons why early breech loaders tend not to have as long range as muzzle loaders do. But the French chassepot, in fact, had such a venting problem out of the back that apparently French soldiers they didn't want to lower their face to aim properly, and so they were tending to pull the trigger with their face far away from the breech and far away from the stock. So that in effect, in reality, results in a loss of accuracy as well. Not necessarily because the gun itself is less accurate, but because the people using it are less likely to aim properly, because it's shooting horrible gases out the back that might go in your eye. The German Drace rifle, the main disadvantage of that, as I understand it, was the short range, but they both had a good rate of fire. So long as you could get close to the enemy, you could shoot them a lot, which clearly is a good thing in the 19th century, or any century. But if we put this in comparison to the British rifle, ironically, the muzzleloader with a much shorter, much slower rate of fire could shoot much further. So theoretically, you could say, okay, if Prussians had fought British people in the 1860s, for example, or if Britain had got involved in the Franco-Prussian War, which is not totally impossible, they may have done. They certainly helped supply the French, I believe. Then there would have been an interesting clash of weapons, because we've got the comparison between the French chassepot and the German drays, but then bringing the British Enfield. Remember now, with the breech-loading adaptation to this, so the Snyder, the Enfield Snyder, the Enfield Snyder actually had a much longer range and a more powerful end result at target. It may have a slightly slower rate of fire, maybe, debatably, but for that reason I think that it would have been very interesting, because the British would have been able to outrange their Prussian opponents, despite the fact the Prussians probably had a higher rate of fire once they got close. Anyway, so let's put this on. So we know that the stopgap Snyder came in, and really what was that the stopgap for? Well, that was the stopgap for my new acquisition. Okay, my new acquisition being this, the famous Martini-Henry. So anybody who has seen films like Zulu or Zulu Dawn or the Four Feathers, any of the Four Feathers films, I think there's about 4 different versions, maybe even more actually. This is the predominant rifle of those, and this was an incredibly important rifle in British history. It was a very important, quite a lot of fighting went on in the period of history. So this came in the 1870s and essentially was in use right the way through in some colonial units until after 1900. In fact, there's still examples of them being used in Afghanistan, or at least copies of them being used in Afghanistan, until the late 20th century. So when Allied forces went into Afghanistan and they were taking weapons off people who'd been shooting at them, they were finding everything from Mausers to Lee-Enfields to even a few of these. Now this was built, unlike the adaptation for the Snyder as a breech loader, which was a stopgap, this was built under competition. So the government opened it up as a competition to different companies. And the winners essentially resulted in what is now known as the Martini-Henry. Okay, and this, if I just show you here, is a very, very simple action whereby with this lever down here, okay, you just pull that lever down and it opens up the breech. You'll see there. Okay, and into that breech you take your bullet out of your pouch, you stuff it in there, okay, and then you pull the lever back up, ba-dump, and it closes the trap door and it's all ready to shoot. Okay, and at that point you simply aim at your target, squeeze the trigger, and you're done. Okay, it's an incredibly simple, strong and reliable action, and in fact this type of action was also used for a type of shotgun called the Greener. The Greener shot, made by Greener, used with a type of special 12 gauge for riot and prison use. But it's an incredibly simple, quick to load. It's not a bolt action. It's not a magazine fed action. So there's no magazine anywhere in here. It's a single shot, essentially lever opening, breech loading rifle with a 45 caliber bullet, powerful round, black powder. So this is pre-modern smokeless powder or nitro. So it's a black powder round, but a big bullet on it. And these were pretty powerful rifles, and most importantly, they did not have the venting problem that some of the French and German early French and German breech loaders had. So it's a very strong and mostly problem for, I mean, obviously there's a very slight degree, but I have to mention as well, so one of the ways to get around the venting problem is the actual design of the cartridge, and the Boxer brass cartridge that went with this, you could say, is as important as the rifle itself. But I'm not going to go into huge amounts of depth on this, but really just say this is my new Martini-Henry. This is a Mark II made by BSA, dating to, which is the Birmingham Small Arms Company, dating to 1877. Which I think is the year that the Mark II came out. If I remember correctly, the Mark I was 1872, 1871, and should have memorised that before filming this video. But so we're talking about this basically occupied the 1870s, and the Mark II was a slight update and improvement on the Mark I. But as I say, this was used by the British military right the way through the 1870s and the 1880s. So we're talking about the Zulu War, the Sudan War, the Afghan campaign of 1880, and it was still being used by Indian troops and other colonial troops up until pretty much the dawn of World War I, but certainly up until 1900 and beyond. And what was it replaced by? Well, it was replaced by a bolt action. So Britain finally, in the 1890s, decided bolt actions have finally got to where we're happy with them. British military was relatively conservative in the technology it took on. So, for example, we'll often see innovations, particularly in firearms and artillery, in the French military come in earlier, and the British don't adopt them until the technology is a little bit more perfected. And you guys have seen this before, but this is my SMLE. So this is not what came in. What came in was the long Lee-Enfield, and this is the short Lee-Enfield, okay? And essentially it's a bolt action rifle, opens up with a bolt action at the back. It's magazine fed as well, importantly. So in the British military, we didn't have really, or at least not mainstream, we didn't have a bolt action rifle without a magazine. We just waited until all that technology was sorted out by other people, and then we basically designed our own version of it. One thing that's unusual about the bolt action on the SMLE, or any of the Lee-Enfields in fact, is that it cocks the spring for the firing pin, which hits the back of the cartridge, upon closing the bolt. Okay, so only when you close the bolt is it now ready to fire. The Mauser action, for example, and most other bolt actions do that when you open the bolt. Okay, so if I close this and hold the trigger down, I can now close that because I'm holding the trigger down and it's not cocked. This bit at the back is the bit that would be cocked. Okay, dry firing I know, not a big fan of, but that's just one. And it's got a safety catch at the back, but that's fairly irrelevant. Right, so this was the short magazine Lee-Enfield. This is essentially just a shorter version of the long Lee. The long Lee came in at the end of the 1890s and was used in the Boer War. The short magazine Lee-Enfield came in to replace the long Lee. There was some misgivings about the fact that it was shorter, and so they gave it a long bayonet, and there were some worries amongst shooters that it wouldn't be as accurate as the longer, but in fact it's just as accurate. This is smokeless powder, nitro. This is not black powder anymore, so they switched in the 1890s from old black powder into smokeless powder. So one thing that's notable is that rifles essentially got shorter, and there's a few reasons for that. So if you look at the 53 Enfield compared to the Martini-Henry, you'll see that the Martini-Henry is quite a bit shorter. It's about 6 inches shorter, I'd say. And then the Martini-Henry compared to the Lee-Enfield, again, the short magazine Lee-Enfield at least is about another 4 inches shorter than that. And there are a few reasons for that. One was because there was a conservative leaning towards longer barrels for greater accuracy. But believe it or not, there was also some degree of retaining longer barrels for bayonet fighting. Okay, so even at that point, even in the 1880s and 1890s, in fact, even in World War I, they were still thinking about the use of the bayonet and what was practical there. And in fact, several militaries during World War I used really long bayonets because they were worried that their rifles weren't very long anymore and they still wanted reach. So certainly, you know, they could have made the 53 Enfield probably just as accurate with just as much muzzle energy with a slightly shorter barrel. But it was perceived that you still wanted a bayonet and musket, or bayonet and rifle, that was still a reasonable height and therefore reasonably useful as a pole weapon. In a future video, I'm going to look at these with the bayonets attached and compare and contrast the Martini with the earlier Enfield and the later SMLE in terms of how they are as hand-to-hand weapons as well. I will almost certainly do more detail. This has been a very quick skip over. I'm absolutely boiling in here. I hope that you're living in air-conditioned places. It's been a quick skip over, really, for people who don't know much about these things. I'm sure if you're a firearms aficionado, you'll be able to point out a couple of things I got wrong, or more that you would have said about this, that, or the other. But mostly, this is just to introduce my new and lovely Martini-Henry, and also a plug. I got this from Neil Aspenshaw of the Martini-Henry Society. I'll put a link below. They've got a Facebook page and they've got a website with fantastic information. So I'll stick a link below if you want to read more about Martini-Henrys. And really, you know, this is the rifle that was behind so many of those famous campaigns from the 1870s right the way through the 80s and into the 90s as well. I'm, you know, very grateful to get my hands on one, and I'm going to be doing some cleaning and stuff on it because it needs a bit of cleaning up. And in due course, so in the UK you can have obsolete caliber, so you can't buy the ammunition for this off the shelf. If it's obsolete caliber at the moment, you can just buy these as antique curios. So it's fully operational, but I can't buy the ammunition for it. I'd have to buy the component parts and self-load. In due course, I will probably put this on my firearms certificate like the SMLE is, and I will self-load ammunition for it and use it on the range. I particularly bought this one from Neil because it has an excellent, very good bore in it, completely unpitted, nice crisp deep rifling, so it should be a good shooter, and I look very much forward to the day when I can get onto the range at Bisley with this and put some rounds through it. But thanks for watching, and yeah, I'm sure I'll be back with more videos soon talking about probably the Martini. I'll probably do a little bit more on the Enfield as well, because I feel I should have done more on that than I have done in the past. I've owned it for a couple of years now. Anyway, thanks for watching and see you guys soon. Cheers! Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We've got extra videos on Patreon, t-shirts on Spreadshirt, and I hope to see you for the next video.